Good morning, and welcome to the session for work study students on PowerPoint and Google Slides accessibility. Um, if you haven't already attended a session, just so you know, we worked on kind of an overall of what accessibility is, what it means, and all of that information, as well as we've done a word remediation. And then yesterday, we also did converting from Word to PDF with and also from Google Docs to PDF. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk today specifically about presentations. And the good news is most of this is still applicable whether you watch the Word session or not. But the big idea is slides have a visual layout, and a screen reader does not see that layout. So when you're building and looking at PowerPoints, the one thing that's super important to understand is that the layout is basically objects. So the screen reader is making sure you have to make sure that the screen reader reads the objects in the correct order. Now, the object order is dependent upon how the slide was built. So if somebody puts something on the far bottom right first, then that's going to always be read first. So that's one of the things that you need to think about when you're looking at PowerPoint presentations. Also, real slide titles. So most of the time, people think they have a slide title, but if it's not labeled as a title, that's a problem. So built-in layouts are the key to keeping that built-in slide layout there. Title. The reading order, color contrast. People like to use a lot of color in PowerPoint. So we're going to spend a lot of time, well, not a lot. We're going to spend 45 minutes talking about these things. So we're also going to talk about exporting a PowerPoint to a PDF. But so the good news is, like I said, it's the same kind of tool in PowerPoint as it was in Word. So every slide. And so what we're going to talk about today are the 5 elements that make a PowerPoint accessible. And that's going to be titles and layouts, alt text, reading order, check export, and then we'll briefly talk about Google Slides. But the Google Slides tool is going to be the same as the Grackle tool that was in our Google Docs. So the big idea. So slides are not Word documents, and the biggest difference is reading order, the order of the visuals that are taking place and the order of the objects as they were built. So uh, the biggest piece is knowing where the tools are and how to use them. So give me 1 second. Let me try to pull up something here. Of course, I can't find it. I'm also going to give you a file to play with so that you can understand exactly what I mean when I say reading order and all of that information. So here we are in PowerPoint. And the first thing you probably can see is that there is some yellow text on a white background. And if you remembered what I said yesterday, um, you need to be able to visually understand accessibility as well as be able to fix the things that need to be fixed. So what I'm going to do right now, and and I will also tell you that there's a little character over here. That's my accessibility issue character. That's going to also tell you that there are things wrong with the slide. Um, so now what we're looking at is, let's look and see. So, and this is obviously a broken image. That's also problematic. So this slide, if you're looking at it, the first thing that you should notice that's not right is there is a click here again, and there is a raw URL. Both of those are not accessible. You cannot have a link that is a raw URL or one that is not descriptive. So that's going to be what you would find on that slide. This slide, at first glance, other than the image, it may look like that you can tell that it looks correct. But we will find out what's broken in that slide in just a little bit. This slide, I'm going to tell you, if you don't know, using all caps is not accessible. So this whole paragraph would be a problem. There's also a color contrast problem with the program description here. And there's actually more wrong with this slide than that. And then moving on to the next slide, what we have here, we have a chart and we have a table. So they look okay, but the question is, have they been tagged appropriately? And then the next slide, again, we have what looks to be correct, but there is some issue with that slide as well. And finally, the last slide, this blue on blue is problematic because that's a color contrast problem. And then this QR code is hanging off the slide. So, but that's, and then the click here to book an appointment, that's actually okay. And then there may be some other things wrong with this slide. So that's kind of an overview of what we're going to look at today. But now I want to go back to my presentation for just a minute. So these are the 5 things that matter. So these are the 5 things that every time you open a PowerPoint that you're going to have to look for. Now, notice that I asked you a minute ago to look for this simply by looking at the slide and deciding whether or not you saw any accessible problems. But now we're going to talk about using the built-in tool for that as well. So I'm sorry, I'm still looking for something. And so once we've got those 5 things memorized, then we are able to understand what it is we're looking for and how to fix it. So the first place we're going to start is a slide title. And I'm going to try to find my other PowerPoint. Well, can't find it. So we're going to move on. It's all good. I probably deleted it and figured I didn't need it again. So when we are looking at any of these files, I'll go back to my PowerPoint. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to Review, and we're going to click on Check Accessibility. So I'll leave that there for just a minute. So it's under the Review tab, and then you're going to check accessibility. So now there are a few things that you will notice. If your version of PowerPoint does not have this option to show only issues on current slide, then you are not in the most recent version of PowerPoint. And again, remember that I mentioned in the Word session that you need to make sure that you have the downloaded desktop version of PowerPoint. You cannot use the Office 365 version because that does not appropriately find or fix accessibility problems. So you do need to have the downloaded desktop version of PowerPoint. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is turn that button on. So from here, you can see that the very first thing it says is missing alt text and slide title. So what I can do now is if I click on the slide title, I can choose what is going to be chosen. So this should be the slide title. So I can click that add as the slide title and then approve it. So now I have fixed that slide. So now if I move to the second slide, again, it's missing a slide title. But let's just say that you happen to be working with an art teacher, and that art teacher does not want the title of the slides on her slide because she or he has it set up in a way that it is much more visually appropriate for art students. So what two things you can do for those? So to hide a slide title, you can click on the box, and if you move the box above the slide, it still is a slide title, but now it's what's called a hidden slide title. So to hide a slide title, that's what you would do. Now, if I just want to set this as the slide title, I can totally do that. So now I have done that as well. So screen readers announce slide titles when navigating between slides. The next thing you also want to think about is if I have the next slide as overview as well, that cannot have the same duplicated title name. And so what happens is there has to be some kind of information. Now, if somebody is really worried about visuals and they don't want anybody to see like version 1 or slide 1 or whatever you want to call it, V1, I'm just going to call it that, then what you could do is you could put in that information and then you could change the color to white. So now it's white on white, and now it's not as visually there, but it's still, but a screen reader would read it. And the reason for that importance is that if a student wants to come back to a slide, then they need to know which slide they wanted to go to. And if it's overview, 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 and they have to listen to all 4 slides, then that is not what we want to do. So the next one is you have to make sure that it is a real title versus a text box. So if I look here, and again, I see that the slide title, notice that again, I have my overview again. So now what I'm going to do is put a V2 in here, and I can again highlight this, make it white text, and now it's disappeared, which is perfect. But now what I want to also do is I want to make sure that this missing slide title gets set as a slide title, because right now it's just a text box. And just a text box, even though it appears to us visually that is a title, a screen reader would not read it as a title. So now, how do you tell the difference between, oh, let me go back. New share. There we go. So if you look, whether or you want to know without using the accessibility checker, you can look at a couple things. The outline view. So if you noticed on my screen when we were looking at it, I had that little window pop open panel, I should say, on the left that gave us kind of an overview of what was there. So if you noticed when you were looking for those slides did not have like titles. In other words, that's that outline view. You also can look at a selection pane, and which is to look at an arrange. That's going to also tell you whether or not the title is first, but that also has to do with kind of reading order. And then if you want to know exactly and just use your keyboard, then if you click in the box and you cycle through, the title placeholder should be the first item focused on every single slide. Okay, so that's how you would tell the difference in titles. So I've already done a demo, so we fixed a few, but I want to go back to my PowerPoint and show you and make sure you understand where that outline view is. So if we look over here now on this in this panel, we see that slides 4, 5, 6, and 7 don't have a title. And I know this because it's not here. So I can click on the box that I want as a title. Actually, I need notice that I had to click twice there because otherwise it would have been the blue bar. And that's not a title. And then we move to the next one. And go back to this one because I missed it. And we look at this one. Okay, so now I have set all of mine as a slide title. If I want to know about this outline, where it came from, then that's going to be your notice up here at the top. You also have the ability to edit the slide title or set the slide title. But this panel itself is actually, let me go back to, oh, sorry. Um, I'll go somewhere else. Let's see. Let me close. So if I go back to accessibility and check accessibility, it's its own tab. And now this little slide out is still here. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is layouts. So from here, you see we have a title. This is talking about the layout. So when you pick a new slide and you're building a slide, you always want to choose a slide layout. Why? Because it always has the title tagged appropriately. It has the content, and there's all different kinds. Built-in placeholders carry that semantic meaning for screen readers. So when you drag a text box instead of using a layout, every object loses its meaning, and therefore the slide may look great, but the accessibility piece is gone. So as a person who's going to be fixing these things, that's something that you need to understand. So fixing a slide that's built wrong. So you can apply a layout, you can click reset, you can copy the placeholders, and then you would delete the empty boxes. So that's going to be, and this, so let me go back to my, oh, maybe. All right. So sorry, I lost my, no, no, yep, there we go. All right, so here we are back in PowerPoint, and I'm back on the first, but now let's go and figure out how to put in a slide, right? So if I want to add a new slide, sorry, wrong one. Here, and you see that it's already telling me the office theme. And if I want to put in a new slide, I can duplicate, I can select from an outline, I can reuse, but I'm just going to go ahead and click on default. Now, the reason that this is interesting is because I created this and I actually changed the default to not have a theme. So let me go to PowerPoint regular that doesn't have a hot mess in it. Hold on. Okay, well, this is not good. All right. Mm. All right. So what I did was I just put in a theme because that was easier. So from here, though, if I wanted to put in a new slide after this first slide, when I click in this, now you can see all of the layouts that I have. So this is where in a normal presentation, that's where you're going to see your slide layouts. You notice that most of them have a title box and a title plus a picture, content with picture, content. So you have all of these different slide kinds to choose from when you are applying a layout. So if you highlight anything, let's see if we can highlight something here. Right here is your layout option. So if I wanted to change this, I could click on that and now I have applied a layout. And from here, you're going to be able to kind of see what's going on. So in PowerPoint, if you want to fix a slide that has content, you're going to choose that slide. Let's pick another one. Maybe. And then you're going to go to layout and then you're going to choose a new layout from the options that you have. Okay, so that's how you would fix the layout, but then you would also have to delete empty boxes. So the next thing we're going to talk about is alt text on images. There we go. So alt text on images. So if you are looking at any kind of PowerPoint or anything, you're going to notice that it's interesting. There we go. You're going to notice that any image should have alt text. What does that alt text look like? Well, let's go back to PowerPoint and take a look. Actually, so let me go back. Let me stay here for a minute. So when you are looking and writing alt text, I told you the other day that you can use artificial intelligence to help you with the alt text if that's what you need. So you can then choose basically between 120 to 150 characters. If you need it longer, then what you will need to do is that you will need to make sure that the alt text has a long description, but that long description is actually going to be on a slide at the end. Then the last thing is if it is purely for decoration, then you just mark it as decoration and move on because that means the screen reader will skip it. So decorative versus meaningful. How do you know that? Well, you may not. You may have to ask. But this is kind of the easiest way to think about this. So if it's meaningful, that means that whatever is conveyed in the image is part of the content and it is necessary. So that means that it tells a story that goes along with the whatever the rest on the slide, then that needs to have alt text. But if it is purely for decoration, that is like background patterns, things like I don't know, if you were talking about chemistry and you had a picture of a chocolate lab, the chocolate lab obviously is not part of chemistry, so that would be decorative. So that's how you kind of think about meaningful versus decorative. So we're going to look at back at our PowerPoint now that I've gotten to this point, and we're going to look at these images. Now, we're going to pretend that this is a picture of students on campus, but it's not, but we're going to say that. But this says there are two things that are missing on this slide. So now if I go here, it's thinking that this blue box at the top is an image. It's not. So that's going to be one we mark as decorative. And then we're going to click this one and we would say students, oh, except I can't spell. Just imagine that's the picture. Okay. And then I'm going to mark save. So that's how you fix alt text. It's really not that difficult. And notice that we have missing alt text on this page, even though there's no image, right? So the image, it's really the divider bar here. And again, we would mark that as decorative. So as you're moving through this, you can see that's kind of what we've got going on here is students in a study group in the library. So now if I click save, and then we move through all of these, again, we have alt text here as well. The blue bar, it's decorative. The green bar, it's decorative. So we don't have to worry about things like that. Now this is a little bit different. So this is actually a chart. So this chart, chart of job place. Now you could type this out like I am, or you could have artificial intelligence do it and you get the point, blah, 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 blah. And then you would click save. So that's how you would fix those. Now this slide, which we were looking at earlier, we said, well, it had a title missing, but now also we know that there's a whole bunch of things here we didn't realize were images. So each of these boxes is an image. So is the divider bar. So is the box around those things. And so all of that we had to mark as decorative so that a screen reader would not read it to the student because that is, I'm just going to say QR. So now we have fixed all of the accessibility issues that were in this PowerPoint. So now let's go back and talk about the next thing. Reading order. So for reading order, what we're looking at, oh gosh, that's tiny, tiny font. Let me make that bigger. I mean, I have glasses on, but I can't read it. This is the one thing that is new that wasn't in Word. It's also the most important and the most thing that probably gets missed the most. So if you have 5 objects on a slide and the slide was built with, let's say they put the image first, then they put the text box next, then they added a title, then they put in a footer. That's the order that the screen reader would read it, even though visually we would see title, list or text, image, footer. But that's not how it works. So your job is going to be align the reading order with the visual layout. So to do this, you're going to open the accessibility tab and then you can choose reading order. And then you're going to drag the order so that it looks correct. So pitfalls. Now, these are some pitfalls. So 2 column slides. The right column often reads first because it was placed on the slide second. Drag the left column below the right in the selection pane. Then decorative graphics still in order. So if objects that aren't marked decorative will be read aloud, then mark them as decorative or remove them from the reading pane altogether. So you can do that and I'll show you. And then animated objects. Objects that appear later in animations are still read in their original placement order, not in their animation sequence. So if you have somebody that has done a lot of animated animation on their slides, that's going to also change your reading order. Okay, So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint and I'm going to open for you the reading pane. So I'm going to go back to accessibility. And at the very top, we see reading pane. Now, at this over here on the right, you see there is a box that tells us the order. So it is top to bottom. We also see that those shapes that I marked as decorative have been removed from the reading order. Now, this appears pretty close. Yeah, pretty close to correct. So let's go back up here to the top. So the first thing, student success and overview, image. Okay, that one's fine. We'll move to this one. That one's fine. This is problematic. So the overview is not first. So what we do here is we can move it up, or you can use the arrows over here to determine. And so I actually want to move that down to the very last thing. So now this is correct, but notice that it tells you over here the boxes in the order that they were put in. So again, we have program description, academic, eligibility, enrolled, and now we move on to the next one. So this is how you're going to check each of the reading order is using this reading order pane. Now, this one, yep, okay. So that's how you would fix the reading order pane. You're going to open that and look at it, and then you also could do the reading order before you do alt text, and so you could remove the decorative things, but that's totally up to you. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is color contrast. Oh, nope, not if I don't share the right screen. So we have a lot of problems with color contrast in this. I already told you about that. I'm going to go back to there we go. So I do see a problem in my personal PowerPoint that I'm looking at is that I don't have the color contrast is not coming up as a problem in the accessibility checker. So I do want you to know that. Sometimes it happens, but we have gray text on white or yellow on white, and both are not accessible. So also, you have to understand one other thing about color. Color cannot be used as the sole way to convey meaning. For example, if you have a green button and a red button, you all would understand, if you're not colorblind, that green means go and red means stop. However, if we don't put the words go and stop on the buttons, then we're using color to convey meaning, and that is not accessible. So speaker notes are accessible to screen reader when they open the notes panel, and they're a powerful tool. So if you have speaker notes, those also need to be looked at, as well as it could have extended image descriptions. You could put in data table transcripts, you could put citations and all of that. Speaker notes are also part of the accessibility check. Now I'm going to go back to PowerPoint. No, yep. And I want you to look at this. So you can see this is obviously not, this is yellow on white, and we already know that that is not an accessible color combination. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to choose a different color. Also notice that I could turn on a feature called high contrast. And because of that, I could change it. Now, notice that if I make this a whole lot darker, that's going to actually pass accessibility. So now if I'm moving through this, also there's a link. These links here would also have to be fixed. This little piece down here at the bottom, although that looks nice and it's not, it needs to be a whole lot darker in order for it to meet accessibility. So you're going to have to go through and you would have to pick colors that would, again, I told you this blue on blue is a problem. So from here, I could choose white, and that would meet the color contrast background. Now, if you aren't sure about accessibility and color contrast, you can, it's not going to show up here. Now, I know you see this inspect without color. That's a good way to test if you have something there that maybe is trying to just, in other words, have color replace the meaning. So you can check this by inspecting without color. You can also, you have lots of other things up here at the top, but I don't see where my color contrast is. Only non-transparent colors are supported. I'm not really sure what that means. All right, so I'll go find out later. But so the accessibility checker catches no title, missing alt text, table, sometimes hard to read color contrast, but as you just saw, not always, and reading order issues. What it will miss is whether or not the alt text is meaningful. There's no way for the checker to check that. Whether reading order actually matches the visual order, and if a title is a real placeholder or just labeled as a text box. So you can use the accessibility checker to help you get a PowerPoint accessible. So the last piece of this is a saving as a tagged PDF. So what you're going to do is run the accessibility checker, then you're going to fix all the things, and you're going to save as a PDF. And again, you're going to make sure that you enable the check document structure tags, and then you confirm. So how do you do that in PowerPoint? Well, you go to File. Now there's one place you have to, there's two things you have to do here. You can either do one before or after. I'm going to go ahead and go to Info. And notice that I already have a title here called Student Success Programs Overview. That's perfect. Next, I'm going to choose Save As. I am not going to choose Save as Adobe PDF because that breaks your accessibility. Then I'm going to choose Browse. I'm going to change this to PDF. I'm going to click on my options. I'm going to make sure this last box is checked. Click OK, click Save, and I'm done. And now I have an accessible PDF. So it's not 100%, by the way, but it's really close. So that's how you would get your PDF into a place that is accessible after you have corrected your PowerPoint. All right, so now I want to talk briefly about Google Slides. Okay, so here we are in Google Slides. And if I go to extensions and I go to Grackle Slides, I can launch this. And wait patiently, have a little coffee. All right, we're getting there. All right, so a slide should have a title. Again, same thing as before. If I click on the slide title, slide 1, Now, the problem with Google Slides, though, is it doesn't give you that great option that PowerPoint does. There's no way to actually fix this as a title. I think last you can apply a layout. Again, you can't change the layout in this one because I don't have anything, but you could add in a title that way. But there's no little quick button to actually allow you to add a title in Google Slides. The next one is images should have alt text. If I click on this, it'll take me to that image. Then if I click on the plus, it's going to either mark it as an artifact, which means it's decorative, or I can put in the alt text. Elements should have alternative text. So these are elements. In other words, things like that dot. That dot is decorative because that's supposed to be a representative of a star, right? So I would have to mark all of those as decorative, every single one. So that's how you would fix all of those. Then this one in slide 2, there's a rectangle around the image. And so we would simply just mark that as an artifact. So that's how you would fix anything as far as the decorative rectangles, ellipse, whatever is in here. The next one is high color contrast. If I go back and I click on any of these, it's telling me that the black box around, or blue, excuse me, around this is not, or not, it's too low, although I'm not sure why. But if I wanted to change the color, oh, actually, all of these are green. And inline, so this is talking about whether or not it's inline style. So this one happens to be, let's see what happens. Again, it's really trying to mark up. It's an artifact, right? It's not it's something else. So this is how you would check things in Grackle. But the key difference is when you go to finish after all of that, you're going to export to PDF within Grackle. You do not want to use the download as PDF option because that will remove all of your accessibility things that you just did. And so you will have to fix those. Now, the last thing I didn't talk about in Google Slides is the slide structure, which is reading order. So you can see that the ellipse, 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 rectangle, rectangle. So this is obviously all of these would need to be fixed because we don't want anybody reading or having to listen to ellipse as part of their when they're listening to the slides. So that's the reading order is actually found there. So the last and we got one, I got one more minute and then I'm done. So run Grackle Slides, fix all the alt text, export through Grackle. And if Grackle isn't good enough, you can download it as a PDF and then go to use it as and go to PowerPoint, PDF. You can download it as a PowerPoint and then go to PowerPoint and fix it as well. So I've already done that. So I'm going to give you now in the chat a couple things. I'm going to give you a handout from the workshop. I'm also going to give you a demo practice PowerPoint that you can go and practice with to see if you can make it work. and check all the accessibility. But again, you want to make sure the first thing that you do is you make sure you have the desktop version of PowerPoint. So let me get you, the first thing I'm giving you is a link to the practice file. And I'm going to stop sharing so you all can find the chat. There's your PowerPoint practice file. And here is your PowerPoint handout with all of the steps of the things that we talked about. And that's it. So, and then the link to the presentation is actually in your handout as the title so that you can come back to the presentation if you would prefer to look at that. And that's all I have. Don't forget, there is also in the presentation a link to, oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I see you all can't get to that document. Hold on. Hold on. Let me go fix that. All right, let me try that again. All right, that link should work now. And 1 second on the power handout. I apologize for that. Try those. They should work. All right, so sorry. No, in the midst of trying to get things done. All right, that's all I have, and I don't want to keep you any longer than my 45 minutes that I said. And don't forget, I have office hours that you can find on my website, as well as accessibility resources that go into a lot more detail on the website and in the Google Drive. And you also have a copy of my email. So tomorrow we're going to talk about caption files and things like that. And how to correct those. That's all I have for today. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out. And thank you all for coming. Have a great day.